Good morning, everybody. It's Afghan Nifty from the Caspian Policy Center. We are planning to have this event in person, but unfortunately, due to uh, weather conditions, we had to switch to online format. But still, I want to thank everyone for taking time and joining to this program. We have a very interesting day and a good program for you, and I'm glad to see a good turnout on the audience as well. So we are launching on our report on how to meet U.S. strategic mineral needs, the Trans-Caspian corridor, Central Asia, the South Caucasus, and Ukraine. A very hot topic recently. Everyone was talking about it. You've seen on the TV and other places as well. But Central Asia, the region that we are talking, the Caucasus, Ukraine, are very important areas when we discuss critical minerals and not adding other important topics we've been discussing about the region and the Greater Caspian region. In that perspective, it was also interesting to see when new Secretary of State Rubio was making his testimony hearing at the Senate. He dedicated a good amount of time on this issue and the U.S.-China competition on critical minerals. And I will say that Central Asia is, of course, a very significant resource for critical minerals. But to unpack all of these, our colleagues at the Caspian Policy Center did a great job to go over Ukrainian, South Caucasus, and Central Asian resources and managed to put together a very interesting report that we are presenting today. The report available on our website. You can check it, but we wanted to see other colleagues who are joining us on this esteemed panel to comment and also provide their views as well. I just a few days ago read on the one of the reports that about 70% of critical metals to China are going from Central Asia. It's just one aspect of the how significant the region is on this topic, and there is a lot more to discuss in that regard. I want to especially thank to Zach, Joshua, Nick, Eric, Rachel for putting all this effort and working on for last few months to produce this report, which provides a significant amount of insights to the potential of Central Asia, Caucasus, and Ukraine in terms of critical minerals and rare earths. I want to turn actually right now to Ambassador Hoagland to introduce our panel and our discussion. Once again, from all over the world who are joining to our conversation here at the Caspian Policy Center, I want to thank everyone, and I wish a good discussion and remarks. Thank you so much. Ambassador Hoagland, floor is yours.
All right, thank you very much, Afghan. Ladies and gentlemen in the audience, very pleased to see you, even if it's only remotely today, because of the weather here in Washington, D.C. As a retired U.S. diplomat, I spent many years working in this region throughout Central Asia and also the South Caucasus. And I can tell you, even until just a few years ago, the term strategic minerals or critical minerals never really rose to the surface very much. I know we talked at the time when I was working there quite often, especially in Kazakhstan, about uranium. But the other things that are terribly important these days and that have risen to the surface now just really weren't on the agenda. But thankfully, we have experts with us today who know what they will be talking about and can tell us what we need to learn and know about the region. So we're going to start in with Ariel Cohen, who's the managing director of Energy Growth and Security at the International Tax and Investment Center here in Washington, D.C. He's long been an expert on the region, and we look forward to what Ariel has to say about, in general, the geopolitics of the region, sort of set the scene for us and for the other experts who will then chime in. So, Ariel, it's over to you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Hoagland. I want to commend the authors of the report, most capably led by Dr. Eric Rodenschild, with whom I always have a pleasure to cooperate, as I do with the Caspian Policy Center in general. and with Ivgan and with the other staff. In addition to my work at the International Tax and Investment Center, I am also a senior fellow at the Eurasia Center at the Atlantic Council, and good to see Reed Blakemore here as well. I've been spending many decades on Central Asia, and quite a few years on rare earths. At ITIC, International Tax and Investment Center, we published a report on rare earths a bit earlier, focusing only on Central Asia. Now I understand that Dr. Rudenschel timed President Trump's statement, yesterday, about the need for the US to grab $500 billion worth of Ukrainian rare earth. I don't know who told him that there are $500 billion worth of rare earth in Ukraine in the middle of the war. But it's timely. It's in the headlines. If you go today's New York Times and AP, you will see that we're talking now about receiving rare earth. Otherwise, America, as the president suggested, will feel stupid by not getting anything in exchange for the billions of dollars of assistance that was provided to Ukraine. I would not guess that Ukraine is in the center of the rare earth play, and it's important for our audience to distinguish between strategic minerals and rare earths. Strategic minerals are not necessarily rare. Titanium is a good example, which is produced in Ukraine and has been. Ukraine was in the center of the Soviet aerospace production for decades. The largest airframe on the planet, Antonov Mriya 223, Antonov 223 Mriya, was produced in Ukraine, a giant, I believe, 80-ton capacity air transport airplane. Aerospace rockets were produced in Ukraine. There are other rare earths in Ukraine that are available, including beryllium, a rare element that is necessary also in aerospace and in metals production. So strategic elements can be what is important for our military-industrial complex, aerospace complex, etc. Rare earth are lanthanoids. These are elements that are adjacent to radioactive elements or are radioactive. They're often mined together with uranium in the similar process or with non-ferrous metals. I will not bore you with metallurgy details. I will only say that if it takes 1, 2, or 3 processes to get, let's say, copper or zinc, it may take up to 24 separate melting processes to get rare earth, and that makes it more expensive. If we talk about millions of tons of ore deposits for iron or copper, we're talking for only tens of thousands of tons, which is orders of magnitude less for rare earths. So looking at the 3 regions in this report, excellent report, I would say Central Asia and especially Kazakhstan are the lead source of a whole bunch of rare earths, followed by Ukraine and then followed by North Caucasus, besides the manganese deposits in Georgia that go back to the 19th century. I think Comrade Stalin was robbing some of the manganese production in Georgia in the 19th century, believe it or not. Other deposits in Armenia, also in Georgia, to a lesser extent Azerbaijan, are in the Caucasus. And in Ukraine, because of the iron ore production, adjacent mining of, I mentioned already, titanium, beryllium, and other elements, are also interesting. But what I would like to stress the most in this presentation is that we are in a whole new era of geopolitical competition, and I think Trump gets it. And before we go down really to the nitty-gritty, to the ground of mining and investment and regulation, let's understand that we are in the 21st century locked in a strategic competition with China. And China is the dominant producer and melter of rare earths. The two components here. One is production, geological exploration, investment in mining, getting it out of the ground. And the second pillar of that industrial complex is melting. You need a lot of cheap energy to melt, and you need to ship, and the shipment chain needs to be secure. So these are all complex challenges that people like the CPC crew, like ourselves, and International Tax and Investment Center, like my company, International Market Analysis, have been dealing with for decades for strategic clients around the world. And China deliberately dominated this sector. Since the 1990s, there were decisions by the Central Committee and Politburo in China allocating resources and deliberately running other producers off the market so that China will grab this jugular, this strategic jugular of industrial production on which our aerospace, our high-tech, computers, chip production, alloys, electric vehicles, electric batteries, all depend. Be it graphite, be it uranium, be it titanium, be it the lanthanoids, that we all are dependent for our lives and our security with these metals. And today, close to 90% of mining, 70%, it went down a little bit, 70% of melting and processing are done in China and by China. And China does not shy away from using the rare earth as a strategic cudgel, as a weapon, just as we do with tariffs, as we do with chip machines that we don't want to export to China. China, in 2010, in a fishing dispute with Japan, canceled some of the exports of rare earths. And just this past December 2024, China stopped exports of technology for processing some of the rare earths, and specifically stopped exports of germanium and gallium that are necessary for semiconductors, antimony that is necessary in military industrial production, and I already mentioned refining technology, signaling that they are not hesitating to keep us on a leash with these technologies. Now, for the last, at least probably from Trump 1, for the last, 7, 8 years, we're talking about the necessity to rebuild American rare earth production. We have only one mine in California that is producing rare earths. There's some discoveries in Wyoming, in Arkansas, in Texas. However, it requires commitment of multi-year procurement contracts from the Pentagon and others, or building supply chains from friendly countries instead of home-shoring, friend-shoring. Where can it be friend-shored from? Canada, Mexico, some Latin American countries, Bolivia, which has a lot of Chinese capital already, is the Saudi Arabia of lithium. For example, lithium is needed for batteries, but Bolivia is no longer friendly for the United States. It has a far-left government. Brazil has a lot of potential. Again, a question mark with Chinese presence and often anti-American rhetoric. In Sweden, there was a big discovery, but focusing on Ukraine, the Caucasus, and Central Asia, I would say the following. Very close to China and Russia, while we are at peacetime, they are not interfering to disrupt, but I'm sure they're watching very carefully. Two, when we are conducting C5+1 meetings once in a blue moon, the first one was President Biden and the Central Asian leaders. Before that, we never bothered to have a meeting on the presidential level. We never had a presidential visit to Central Asia. We put something like $4 million, correct me. I would ask our diplomats to correct here if I'm off with some numbers, but I believe it was $4 million to develop trade relations with Central Asia, whereas President Xi showed up with $4 billion the same year, 23 or 24. As Ambassador Hoagland mentioned, they did not talk very much about rare earth. They talked about human rights a lot. We won't mention any names of senior diplomats at the State Department who I never heard the words rare earth from their mouths, people in key positions. Russia will send Putin, or Putin will send himself to Central Asia at least once a year, if not 2 or 3 times a year. President Xi sometimes would show up in Kazakhstan as the first destination after renewal of his term. The leaders of Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and other countries would go to Beijing and Moscow several times a year. The Wuhan meeting by Xi with a number of Central Asian presidents demonstrated the priority, and also he provided billions and billions of dollars worth of investment announcements in that meeting. So it's good to have the rhetoric. It's good that ourselves, CPC and others, are trying to put it on the map, but it's kind of like when I worked for a big think tank here in town for decades, and every couple of years wrote a piece about how we need to be involved in the Arctic, and said that we have only one diesel icebreaker and Russia has 20 nuclear icebreakers. And everybody said yes, yes, yes. Had a hearing on the Hill, had a commission at the Pentagon, a 3-star Coast Guard admiral. Is there such thing as 3-star Coast Guard? 2-star. Okay, Coast Guard admiral will chair a task force. And then the Academy of Science will send the Healy to the Antarctica, the only working icebreaker, and we will be with 0 icebreakers. And this reminds me of the situation with rare earths right now. And the question is, are we too late? Because it takes years to invest in the supply chain, make the supply chain secure, and actually start making and shipping these metals. So my hope is that CPC is putting this issue on the line, and that we all will gather together and go brief Eric's successors at the National Security Council and say, guys, sort out what the best thing I liked in that report is the list of confusing and discombobulated regulations and pieces of legislation that you list. Okay, it's a disaster. We need streamlined line of authority with clear interagency, if there is such thing as interagency. And to be utterly cynical, I don't want to be in the shoes of that ambassador or that CEO who goes into a smoke-filled room in Central Asia with a briefcase full of cash, knowing that he will not or she will not be prosecuted these days, as we found out yesterday, under Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, and offer Minister of Mining the facilitation fee. I would recommend strongly against that. I want the record to show. But I think that move was a move against Beijing. And in the real world, President Trump inhabits he thinks in those terms. I'll leave you with that. Thank you.
Ariel, thank you so very much. You've set the scene with excellent background information. You've given us regional and global overview information. This puts us well on the track. Before we move on to our next speaker, for those of you in the audience who are watching, we will have definitely a question and answer session. So if you look at the bottom of your screen, you should see a Q&A symbol. Please use that to ask your questions, since we don't have you on our screen here today. And that way, we won't be able to answer probably every question that comes in, but we will be able to interact with you around the world who are watching today. Now, we're going to move on with our excellent scene setters here. We're going to go to Pini Althas, who's the managing partner of Cove Capital, LLC. And Pini, we'd love to hear you talk about your experiences, challenges and opportunities of actually working on the ground in the region. And I'm sure you have much more to tell us too. So we turn it over to you, sir. We look forward to what you have to say.
Good morning. Thank you, Ambassador, and thank you to everyone at the Caspian Policy Center for arranging this, a very important subject matter, and welcome to all those in the audience. So as some of you may be familiar, I've been involved in developing critical minerals assets, mining assets, pre-2018, but since 2018, my focus has been on critical minerals, and I've been involved in the development of some assets here in the United States. But in 2022, I was introduced to an opportunity in Kazakhstan on some areas of East Kazakhstan, very prospective areas where the Russians had operated over a period of 5 decades during the Soviet era. And one of the good things, and Ariel mentioned a number of really valid points in his introduction, but one of the good things is when you're working off Soviet data, it's extremely detailed and meticulous. In fact, one of the things that we find, which is an anomaly when you look at the West, and in the West, mining companies tend to over-exaggerate resources, reserves, etc., is that we find, and in fact, the CIA has dealt with this, and the Toronto Stock Exchange has dealt with historical Soviet data. We find that because there was an onus on the exploration managers to provide Moscow with production criteria or production schedules for 5 years, we often find that there is an understatement of mineralized zones, resources, reserves, etc. So we found that actually in our first year of drilling last year in Kazakhstan. But sort of getting back to Central Asia and the opportunities for the United States, US companies, Western companies, etc. So when we embarked on this in 2022, the first challenge was, well, if we're dealing with concessions that have historical reserves, resources, tailings, etc., often it's very difficult for companies to acquire these concessions without the right contacts, without the right moves in countries like these, which may contravene the FCPA, which Ariel referred to earlier. So sort of given our work with the US government, both during the first Trump administration, the Biden administration, I was able to show members of the National Security Council, the State Department, the Department of Commerce, what these concessions in Kazakhstan that we were being offered looked like, and they pledged their support. And we were planning to apply for these concessions in early 2023 when Kazakhstan announced that it had entered into an agreement with the United States for the US to bring critical minerals developers, investors, etc. to the country. And then Secretary of State Blinken went in early February of 2023 to Astana to sign an agreement. And that then provided sort of a much clearer path for us to establish a direct relationship with the government of Kazakhstan, with strong support from the US government and the ambassador in Astana. And we were able to pick up 9 extremely prospective concessions that host everything from tailings from prior Soviet production to beryllium, tantalum, niobium, cesium, rubidium, tin, lithium. And then in April of last year, we entered into a joint venture with Talkun Samruk, which is a state-owned mining company, and in fact, the mining company that provides 43% of the world's uranium, and much of the United States' uranium. and we entered into a joint venture to develop the state-owned Akbulak rare earth deposit that has also historical resource from Soviet days. And so we're starting to assist with the development of that project as well. But what's important to note is that what we keep hearing, and now we've actually been engaged quite closely with the government of Uzbekistan as well, in addition to the government of Tajikistan, which is one of the largest exporters of antimony, one of the critical minerals banned by China on December 3rd of last year. And what we're hearing across the board, and not just from leaders in Central Asia, but in Africa as well, is the absolute need for them to diversify away from China. Now, some of this diversification is required because of, let's say, the Belt and Road Initiative and how that has not worked out favorably, or the loans for infrastructure or for mining projects that hasn't worked out well for many of these countries. But what we find as well is that when China go into these countries, firstly, ecologically, how they develop these projects may not be in line with the host country or international practices or standards. But we also find is that China is not establishing a vertically integrated supply chain in these countries. In order for these countries, a country like Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, to be prosperous and to be a key supplier of critical minerals to the West, it needs to establish a vertically integrated supply chain, which means downstream processing, alloys and metals, magnet manufacturing, battery manufacturing, etc. This is not something that China brings to the table. As part of our work in Kazakhstan and our upcoming work in Uzbekistan, for example, we have pledged to bring processing technology, employ locals. For example, in Kazakhstan, under the President's Bolshak Scholarship, where students travel to different universities and learning institutions around the world, like the Colorado School of Mines in the US, to employ them back in Kazakhstan at our mines, at our labs, etc., so that the countries can start to establish their own domestic expertise in this area, and also start to build a long-term mining sector from the ground up. So exploration activities as well, because at the end of the day, there are a few mining projects in each country that may go into production in the foreseeable future, but there needs to be early stage exploration, which is a challenge on its own. It's very difficult to fund these projects, but that's something that needs to be done. So this is one of the things that we're doing, technology transfer, assisting with establishing a vertically integrated supply chain. One of the things that we've seen, which again Ariel touched on, is the C5+1, which was an important catalyst in terms of establishing sort of a formal path forward or a formal relationship between the United States and the 5 Central Asian countries. However, we've heard a lot of sort of criticism around the MSP, the Mineral Securities Partnership, that agreements are signed between the United States and these countries, and then nothing happens for a long time. There's been a lot of concern around sort of the DFC process. So there's a lot to do in terms of actually moving the ball forward, where the Central Asian countries feel that they have a real partner in the United States. And again, as Ariel touched on, we're seeing sort of, I think, a very commercial approach by President Trump to this issue. So to look at Ukraine, for example, so a vast percentage of the critical minerals that are in Ukraine are in the eastern part, currently occupied by Russia. And whether or not Russia does see that as part of any future peace process remains to be seen. That being said, even, and I'm highly skeptical they will, but even with the remaining critical minerals in Ukraine, much of this is early stage, it's greenfield, it'll take a lot of time, energy, and resources to develop it. That being said, it's a prudent move to lock up as much of these minerals and opportunities as we can, but the onus will be now on how does the US actually develop these concessions, which companies are going to develop it, how is it going to get funded, because it's certainly not going to be by the majors. The majors will not get involved in early stage exploration, certainly not greenfields. So a lot of questions as to how this will be done. In terms of downstream processing capabilities, our company Cove has always been sort of open to looking at these opportunities, and we'll keep an eye on this as well. Sort of just to talk a little bit about sort of how things could move forward in the US. We've talked about sort of interagency cooperation, and the question was, well, what interagency cooperation? So we've got multiple departments, Department of State, Commerce, Defense, Interior, Energy, all dealing with the critical minerals issue. The initiatives that they've undertaken are important. However, in terms of practicality, it hasn't led to much so far. So if you look at what's happened in the last 4 years, very little has happened. If you look at these agreements that the US has signed, for example, with very close allies like Australia, which is going to be or is one of the largest exporters of critical minerals outside of China. Most of these projects in Australia already have offtake agreements with Chinese companies or companies from other countries like Japan, Germany, etc. Nothing has sort of come into the United States. There's nothing on the table to come into the United States. So what's really required at this stage in the US to coordinate all these efforts, not just in Central Asia, but globally, is some leadership, maybe in the form of a critical minerals czar, a special envoy, that somebody sort of at a senior level position, perhaps at the executive office of the president, has to coordinate these efforts to streamline everything that these agencies are doing. Otherwise, we'll be left with sort of sitting here in another 4 years saying we haven't moved the needle forward in terms of practically bringing these materials into the supply chain. So the other thing I should mention about Central Asia and Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan in particular is because they are looking to attract Western investment. And since we came into the market in Kazakhstan in early 2023, we've seen Kazakhstan sign agreements with South Korea, with the UK, with France, with Germany and others. The mining reforms have taken place under President Tokayev. They're streamlining the processes to make it easier for US and Western companies to apply for concessions. There's a lot more transparency that's been added to these processes to enable Western and US companies to participate in obtaining concessions in these countries. And we're seeing a concerted effort. So, for example, in Kazakhstan, you've got the AIFC, the Astana International Finance Center, which is under UK jurisdiction, run by UK judges, including the former Supreme Court Justice of the United Kingdom. So there are efforts there also to lessen the jurisdictional concerns. So just in closing, in summary here, we're seeing a significant opportunity for the United States and for US companies interested in developing critical minerals assets and mining projects in Central Asia. As Ariel said, I'm hoping that President Trump does give a lot more attention to this region, because really, if you look at where critical minerals are available, I would say Central Asia may be the lowest hanging fruit right now in terms of the ability to source projects that have existing reserves, resources, not necessarily having to look at developing greenfields projects, and with a government in that region that's willing, ready, and able to do business with the United States. Thank you. You're on mute, Ambassador.
I'm so sorry about that. There we go. What I was saying was, thank you so very much for that excellent background that added to our understanding of how the United States and others can actually work on the global market on this new issue, essentially new issue that is becoming terribly, terribly important. So thank you for that. You've helped us to understand how to compete on the global stage from your own experience on the ground doing this. That was excellent. I'd like to turn now to Reed Blakemore. Reed is the Director of Research and Programs at Global Energy Center at the Atlantic Council here in Washington, D.C. Reed, give us your view on this issue. I know you're going to talk some about supply chains and value chains, but in general, the floor is open to you. Now, before you start, let me remind our audience who's watching that you can pose questions in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. So please go ahead, Reed. We look forward to what you have to say on this terribly important issue.
Thank you, Ambassador, and congratulations to Eric and the CPC team for this really robust report is actually the phrase I'd use. The level of detail that you've added to the field here is really impressive and frankly, much needed. It's also good to be on the panel with a fellow Atlantic Council colleague and Ariel, who's also been a great collaborator on these critical minerals issues here at the Atlantic Council. I'm finding myself actually kind of touching on a number of points that have already been said. What Ariel mentioned with regard to the issues around the temporal issues around how long it takes to stand up some of these alternative supply chains, project timelines, et cetera, being a challenge. It all speaks to the urgency of from the United States to at least be very precise and targeted in terms of how it provides the policy support necessary to engage the region effectively in supply chain creation. And to me, when I reflect on what has now been consecutive administrations, both Republican and Democratic, giving attention to the issues associated with supply chain dependency on China for these strategic materials, critical minerals, and rare earths. A big gap has been an ability for the administration to take almost a holistic approach to the entire supply chain. Because one of the things we frequently found is that while we can be effective in standing up new upstream resources, the utility of those new upstream resources or the expansion of those resources to actually enabling some diversification throughout the entire supply chain is somewhat held hostage by China's broader dominance of the midstream. And so that speaks to a need to think through three areas, I think, that come to mind as we sort of lay out what a more effective critical mineral supply chain policy could be. That starts, in my mind, with parsing out more effectively what we're solving for within each of these respective minerals, right? The report mentions and introduces this idea of relative criticality. It uses a chart that was developed by the Department of Energy a year and a half ago, looking at what is a risk now versus what will be a risk over the long term. I would add that in addition to that, we need a sense of whether or not we're solving for capacity risk due to the inflationary pressures of a lack of capacity in the copper supply chain, for example, versus what we're addressing from a security perspective with regard to the uranium supply chain, the lanthanide supply chain, things like tellurium, beryllium, et cetera. Because that changes the type of investment, both financial and political strategy that we need to deploy as the United States in order to unlock some of this dependency on China, which brings me to my second point, which is this does then bear strongly on how you're addressing the challenges within the midstream. Ariel mentioned processing and refining as a major bottleneck, right, within the effectiveness of our supply chain management. And I think that warrants some more attention from policymakers here in Washington to really adopt the strategies that are going to enable non-Chinese midstream activity, whether that's locally next to the mine in terms of beneficiation and refining, or further on downstream with regard to almost, precursor manufacture, or even going down to the component manufacturing side. There are a number of inputs there which actually make this problem bigger, but in a way broaden the ways in which the United States can actually support supply chain resiliency. The key element there is actually, as Ariel mentioned, and I think Pini mentioned as well, the power demands of the midstream sector, right? The largest capital input to most project economics associated for a midstream project is the reliable and cheap electricity, right? And so where you can draw a power generation project as part of a midstream supply chain resiliency effort is absolutely critical and possibly draws better on the existing tools and strategies that the United States uses in other non-supply chain fora. The other piece that I would mention is this does come back to logistics and how you're getting this material out of the region and to the United States. A huge effort made by the Biden administration was the development of the Libido corridor in sub-Saharan Africa as part of a wider strategy to more effectively get material from the copper belt westward. I think we need to think of a similar effort with regard to the middle corridor in the region, right? How are we going to effectively get this stuff out of the region and to the West to improve both the market share that China currently has in terms of the flows of resources eastward, but also give project developers, downstream customers, greater reliability that as they invest in these projects, they're going to effectively get out on time, on schedule, and reliably. That will then also have these broader easements to resolving the project economics and de-risking these investments in the first place. That does then bring me to a third point when we start thinking about logistics and moving downstream. And Ariel, you mentioned this again as well. Having a frank conversation around where we expect value add in the supply chain to actually fall will be a critical part of what makes these partnerships successful. The United States has frequently struggled with minerals development in sub-Saharan Africa with regard to resource-rich nations demanding certain parts of the value chain to be locally placed. In some cases, that's very viable. In other cases, that just widens the problem associated with labor, associated with power demand, all the way down the supply chain. And that also then begins to rub against some of the United States' own goals with regard to industrial manufacturing and reshoring, the things they're actually hoping to do with these materials in the first place. The challenge with that is that's less of a problem of project economics and investment de-risking. That ultimately is a political problem. And navigating those politics, I think, will be one of the foremost challenges with how this region will need to engage with the Trump administration during his last term in office. I see a world in which the Trump administration is going to be much more conditional in terms of the direct and immediate benefits to U.S. industry as part of these supply chain partnerships. How that plays into value add creation locally, Pini, I'm talking less about kind of the ecosystem value add. I think as part of these investments, skill building, investment in kind of the wider labor and human capital pool in the region is absolutely necessary. But when you start having a conversation around which projects are directly benefiting U.S. industries and U.S. companies, that relationship will need to be very firmly established, and I imagine in the eyes of the president, be very direct and very immediate. I do not foresee a policy environment here in the United States where the administration is willing to facilitate or directly invest in these projects, but not see that immediate value add to its broader goals around industrial manufacturing here at home, or at least the benefits to U.S. mining mining and manufacturing companies when they do go abroad. I'll stop there. I think those are three issues, but just to summarize briefly, being more thoughtful about the tools we have specifically in the midstream is going to be critical to addressing this issue that Ariel mentioned of time. We don't have a lot of time due to the nature of the amount of time it takes to develop a new supply chain asset, which also means we don't have a lot of margin for error in which projects we devote our political capital to. And I think having that awareness, having an improved sharpness around which mineral classes we're actually going to intervene in versus those which we're just going to work to develop broader capacity is going to be a critical first step to enabling policymakers to make the right partnerships, implement the right policies, and ultimately downstream enable the right investments to be made, which quickly and efficiently de-risk U.S. vulnerabilities vis-a-vis China.
Right, Reed, thank you so very much for that. I'm pleased that you noted China's dominance of the midstream and then especially three ways to move forward. It's very important to navigate the politics of this issue. It's not just minerals in the ground, it's politics in high-level offices around the world. We're going to move forward again, this time to Eric Rudenschild, who is the Senior Fellow at the Caspian Policy Center and my good colleague. Eric is going to, has been in the Trump and Biden administrations both, giving him a special insider's view. And he's seen much of this in the past. Excuse me very much. And so we look forward to Eric, you wrapping this up and telling us your expertise on this entire issue. Thank you.
Thank you, Dick. I'm in incredibly difficult situation following three powerhouses on this topic. It doesn't really get better than this panel. I'm honored to be part of it. I would simply say, China's dominance in critical minerals is not an accident. It has been a decades-long set of investments that they have done. I think their dominance in critical minerals, the supply chains, their protectionist policies, basically their weaponization of access to certain minerals is a direct threat and challenge to the United States and to our global industries that are reliant on these specific resources. We have in the United States supply chain dependence challenges. These minerals are necessary for many of our industries. The rare earths, strategic minerals can be used for our technology and manufacturing chips, for aviation, communications, renewable energy. It's pretty much across the board that we are relying on for the next generation developments on these particular minerals. I think in our report we note in 2022 China controlled 100% of global graphite processing, 90% of rare earth processing, 74% of cobalt processing. They're the world's primary supplier. By stark contrast, the United States is simply reliant on imports. It's sourcing more than 50% of our annual consumption for 31 out of the 35 critical minerals from foreign supplies. And, this is a reliance that, is unfortunate in many ways, but it is the reality that we find ourselves in at this point. And, digging out of this hole is going to definitely be the work of this administration and probably the one after it. The report that we've put forward here is designed specifically for policymakers and people who are interested in the rare earth challenge. I can say, in the first Trump administration, we looked very much at the whole challenge of strategic minerals. Where do we find them? We looked at Greenland. We looked at Central Asia. Central Asia is so far away. The phrase was used, the juice wasn't worth the squeeze at that point. But a lot has changed in the last 4 years, and I think the advent of the Middle Corridor is a real game changer for access. And I also think the geopolitics that we see in the region, and Ariel certainly alluded to some of this, sanctions have really brought such levels of change to the countries in the Caucasus, in Central Asia, certainly, obviously, Ukraine. But there are tremendous opportunities. They're looking for alternatives on who they do business with now. The Central Asian countries in particular, they're not looking to trade a master from Moscow for one in Beijing. They're looking to be global players. And so I think, what panelists have said before about, these are brownfield opportunities. They've already got minerals that are in development, that mines exist. These aren't greenfields. They aren't just simply something that we know there's a deposit there and we have to build a mine. And then there's the issue of refining and processing. And that's been China's really its strategic leverage. They source materials from all over, and then they control the refining and processing. And that's really where a lot of the money is. And I think those are the deals that can be struck with these countries, particularly in Central Asia, that they're looking to capitalize on their resources. And so if we invest and work with them, partner with them on the processing in country, that midstream area, there's a real opportunity. And certainly Central Asia is rich in power, the kind of stable power that's necessary in order to be able to cost effectively process minerals. I would say, what we've looked at in the past, for the region, and the Biden administration moved the ball forward somewhat on critical minerals, the dialogue. But one of the challenges that we've faced from the US government is not having a budget for development and being somewhat timid on engagement. And you've got now a Republican-controlled executive and two chambers of the legislature. They've got the purse strings. So there's the ball's in their court to actually move forward on this. And I think, with a budget, you can actually get progress in some of these areas. Unleash DFC. President Trump created DFC specifically to go after these kinds of opportunities. Well, there you go. Unleash the dragon. I think, we can really take advantage of what are opportunities that with countries who are anxious to partner with the United States. And, that hasn't always been the case. But I think, now we see a different playing field. And it's certainly the geopolitics of Russia and its engagement. I would say our Secretary of Defense announced just this morning that a return to 2014 borders in Ukraine is unrealistic. Well, that takes off the table a number of potential spots in Ukraine, if in fact that becomes a reality, for strategic mining. I don't see Russia as being a stable partner for the United States. The United States has to think creatively and what it does and how it engages and where it picks its partners. Reed really hit that nail on the head perfectly. I think, we've got to approach things in a way that we haven't done before. I think, creativity in governance and planning is not always seen as well, it's not seen as normal. And I would say, you look at what's happened. The Exim Bank has really adopted a pretty novel financing tool that really strengthens U.S. supply chains and can help us reduce the reliance on the People's Republic of China, specifically in these areas. They created the Supply Chain Resiliency Initiative, very creative. Congress likes it. Let's jump on that. Let's actually make that happen. Critical minerals is where investment is, where the game is going to be played in the coming decade for certain, and probably beyond that. It is the transition from old energy to new energy, and who basically gets the ground game in, who gets the offtake agreements, who can actually land these particular elements for manufacturing. That helps economies move forward. That's a partnership between Central Asia, the Caucasus, potentially Ukraine in some areas, and the United States that I think is undeniable. So we put together a paper here. It's now online as of this morning. Please, I encourage you to download it. It's, as we advertise it, it's everything you want to know about critical minerals, but didn't know to ask. As I say, we lay out the U.S. dependence challenge. What are these minerals used for? So you can actually understand them a little bit, the green energy side, the military, the tech side, but the confusing matrix of U.S. policies, EU policies. They are a major competitor for us at this point in trying to secure this stuff. It is a nightmare. And so I think what Reed talks about, what Peeney talks about, the need to actually come up with a targeted approach. That's exactly in our recommendations that we put forward. And then probably the most interesting section for people who play Trivial Pursuit is who's got what. There's an end section looking at each of the countries. It talks about which country has certain kinds of deposits that we know of. Where are they? It's Reed's shopping list of what we should be looking at, because if we don't move forward with targeted efforts for specific minerals that we really desperately need, China stands to weaponize even further our supply chains and make us all that much more vulnerable. So I'll leave it at that and leave it to, I see we have some questions up, so I'll stop there. Thanks.
All right, Eric, that was really, really good. Gave us so much more information that we're dealing with on this important topic. As the moderator, I'll take the prerogative of doing the first question here, but we will turn to you in the audience who have been posting. Over the past 10 years, a policy called multi-vector foreign policy has emerged especially in Central Asia, but across the Caspian into the Caucasus too. And that was first enunciated by the government of Kazakhstan. And what it means is keeping a balance among the great powers, Beijing, Moscow, Washington, and Brussels. And the countries have done a pretty good job with that, I would have to say. More recently, rather than multi-vector foreign policy, they're defining it as strategic neutrality, meaning they take what is positive from every one of the powers, and they don't turn against any one of the powers either. So they keep themselves balanced. We also have to deal with I don't want to call them secondary powers because they're terribly important in the region, but we have to think about Turkey. We have to think about Iran. We even have to sometimes consider what's going on in Afghanistan these days because it does affect the region. So, the first question I'm going to ask here is we can't escape that the Trump administration has become somewhat controversial in some quarters. I wonder if you could please give us your view of how the essential countries in the region that deal with critical minerals are seeing this administration and what can they do to build a strong and positive relationship with Washington that would mean that both sides can move forward in a positive way then. Uh, that's a little bit of a political question, but it's also very, very much related to the economics of this issue. So, who would like to go first on this? Is there anyone who has some thoughts?
I'm happy to.
Yes, Peony, please. Over to you.
Yes, so I can tell you, whilst we're all looking here at Washington over the past couple of weeks, and there's a lot of unpredictability. The one thing is culturally, and you all at the Caspian Policy Center understand a lot more about the mindset of the Central Asian countries. But I think there's firstly culturally, and my family does come from Russia and Ukraine, I should mention. My grandfather's Ukrainian, my father was born in Russia. So I can tell you that there is a respect for strength. So when there's sort of a lot of flailing about in Washington, and there's not a lot of direction, that often causes confusion among the leadership about what US policy actually is. I can tell you there's no questions right now about what US policy is since January 20. They understand there's a clear objective here by the president. They also want to see deals happen. So as I mentioned before, while there was a lot of important initiatives undertaken by the Biden administration, and the C5+1 was certainly important, it helped our company, as well in terms of being able to get a foothold and sort of operate in countries like Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan. Nevertheless, there needs to be deal making. One of the questions that were asked was how do Central Asian countries secure downstream technology? This is something that is part of a discussion. The Central Asian countries, they do have some downstream processing for some minerals, but not for all minerals. So technology transfer is one of the things that was dealt with under the original MOU signed between the United States and Kazakhstan. Educating locals in terms of having expertise for developing critical minerals assets is something the United States can do. One of the other things that we've seen is that the US Geological Survey is active in these countries. So one of the criticisms I've had, and again, this is not to criticize an agency, for the sake of criticizing, but rather constructive criticism, is if the USGS is going in and mapping areas of Kazakhstan, for example, why is the United States providing these services on concessions that can later be picked up by Chinese companies, Russian companies, European companies, etc.? So a quid pro quo, or let's call it more of a commercial approach to this, can be found. And I think that, if there is a president to do it and an administration to do it, it is this administration. So, for example, the USGS goes in, works with Kaz Geology, for example, mapping out certain areas, but then US companies should have the right of first refusal to acquire those concessions or pick up those concessions. That's one thing. Technology transfer is another thing that can be done. Improving the way the DFC handles itself in terms of dealing with these countries. We've seen since January 20, since the inauguration, Exim announced sort of an expansion of what it would look at funding. So looking at how Exxon can fund projects in Central Asian countries. So I'm feeling optimistic about what's going to happen. And I think, the leaders of these countries, while, looking at what's happening in Washington, I think that they're actually sensing an opportunity for deals to actually happen now between the US in terms of developing critical minerals assets.
All right, thank you very much, Beanie. Eric, I see you have your hand up there. You want to add to this, please go ahead.
Yeah, I thanks, Dick. This is a great question. The multivectoral policies of these countries are designed to help them navigate, the geography that they find themselves in. They do business with their neighbors, of course, but dependence on any one neighbor is never a good thing in terms of trade. And so they're particularly looking now, and sanctions have really made a big difference in how they approach their business. They're looking to engage with the West, as I'd mentioned in my earlier comments. I think, there is, as Peony points out, there are some real opportunities for investment. And the U.S. has been engaged with them. The USGS has done long yeoman's work for years with these countries. But I agree, it's been a gift from the American people. Now there's a real opportunity for something more to be done. I'd add one other comment. We talked about the Ukraine situation, and I feel like I should throw in Ukraine because we made a point of adding them in this report. There are a lot of critical mineral resources in Ukraine that are west of the Dnieper River. And there's so much focus on Luhansk and Donetsk, and it's like, oh, what's going to happen, with Russia's at war? That country's got a lot of stuff that you can find within the peaceful zone, and again, ripe for partnership. I don't think the United States should put all its eggs in a Central Asian basket or a Caucasus basket or Ukrainian basket, but these are regions that are all looking to work with us, and so I think, we would be foolish not to pay attention to that. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Eric. There are two different types of hands up. I saw that, Ariel, you physically raised your hand, and then Reed, you have the sign up. So Ariel, you were first, so please, over to you, sir. And then we'll turn to Reed for his comments on this issue. I think you are muted, Ariel.
How about now?
Now you've got it. Go ahead, please.
Good. Yes. So in terms of the Soviet data, as a son of a Soviet PhD geologist, I can tell you that while some of the data, as Spinney pointed out, was detailed and maybe even understating, these are 3 generations technology that is three generations old. If you talk about 2-dimensional Karataj versus 3-dimensional Karataj using modern geophysics, you have so much more that you can visualize today. You can use satellite technology that didn't exist in the 1960s and 70s. So we are 2 or 3 generations ahead of the Soviet data. Secondly, Ukraine, Caucasus, and Central Asia are underexplored still, as many other parts of the world. So when we're saying China got all this mining and refining going on, this is because companies were not in the position to explore, and then the contracts, long-term contracts that would justify the investment, they were not there. So it's up to the governments. Finally, a point of how we perceive, or how people in the region perceive, the Trump administration. One, I will direct our audiences to something called destroyers for bases deal in World War II. In 1940, the Brits wanted to buy 50 destroyers to fight the Nazis. And this is Roosevelt and Churchill, US and the United Kingdom, the British Empire, much closer than US and Ukraine or US and Central Asia. And President Roosevelt, our great leader, a progressive president, said, okay, we have this old World War I destroyers. We can lease them to you in exchange for 99-year naval bases in the Caribbean and Newfoundland. So these neo-mercantilist exchanges in security situations like the war in Ukraine are not unheard of. So let's put that in perspective as well. And finally, I am aware of countries getting on board early on, a country like Kazakhstan saying to the Trump administration, we're willing to cooperate on immigration and repatriation of illegal migrants with you, the Trump administration. We are willing to work with you on uranium and rare earths. So some of these countries understand the new nature of our administration, the new mindset, zeitgeist, and priorities, and are very much on board to do that. And honestly, today it's Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan. The three other countries are still trying to figure out, who are they purging and why in Tajikistan, or how they're managing their gas economy in Turkmenistan and whatnot.
All right, Ariel, that was a very good addition. And we turn to Reed now to answer this question before we move on to the next question. So Reed, it's your turn. And I think you are also muted. Please unmute.
I'm unmuted now. There we go.
There we go.
A brief two-finger on what Peony said. I agree that as a feature of this administration, we're likely to see a much more flexible DFC and XM as tools in the toolkit for the United States to engage in these projects. However, I would caution that with that freedom, perhaps, you will still see, and perhaps see, an escalation of foreign entities of concern language associated with those investments, right? And that will extend, if I'm reading into kind of this administration's approach more broadly to port infrastructure, et cetera, that will extend beyond just the mine site or beyond just the midstream asset. There will be concern associated with the balance of Chinese ownership, for specifically vis-a-vis the mine site, the midstream, but also the rail and port infrastructure needed to get the material out. And so, yes, XM and DFC will certainly be very valuable, very liberated tools that I think the U.S. will deploy in the region. But with it will come a challenge for the region to grapple with how it balances or manages those preconditions around foreign entities of concern that might rub against the multi-vector policy that's been adopted in the region for the past several years.
Okay, thank you very much, Reed. We're going to turn to some of the questions that have been coming in now. And let me apologize in advance if I don't get to your question, because our time is moving along here. And what I'm also seeing on the question and answer function is that some of the questions are posed and then seem to disappear. Thankfully, I've been jotting down some of the key issues here. So what I'd like to do is turn to an issue that was posed by Dr. Marcia McGraw-Olive, who many of us know in Washington as one of the experts in this region. And she was asking, what can the relevant countries do to encourage private sector investment from the U.S. and the West in general? We've been talking an awful lot about government to government issues here, but what can these countries that have the resources do to encourage and see the value of the West private sector investing in their countries? Any thoughts on this from anyone? Yes, Pini, you go first, please.
Yeah, I mean, firstly, they've got to make it a welcoming environment for US and Western companies. So the understanding is that we have to adhere to the FCPA. So let's say some of the ways that some of these countries would traditionally, I guess, engage in these processes would not be suitable for US and Western companies. So as we've seen, as I mentioned earlier, in the case of Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan reforming various things to enable US companies in particular to operate in the country. And then I think clearing a number of the hurdles as well and the bureaucracies once in country. And again, in recent times, we've seen the willingness by Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan to make it easier. So, for example, the export of samples, if the laboratories in Kazakhstan are not equipped to handle various minerals, those export licenses have been granted quite quickly. In our case this year, which has enabled results to come back from the labs in a timely manner. And I think, we're seeing a very strong willingness by these countries to enable Western companies to bring downstream technology, because, as I mentioned earlier, establishing a fully integrated supply chain. So in the case of rare earths, mine to magnet, in the case of lithium, for example, mine to battery, is something these countries desperately want to do. And they understand that that's where they realize the greatest profits in terms of being an exporter of critical minerals.
All right, very good. I see two more hands raised on the screens here. I'm going to turn to Eric first, and then we'll move on to Blake again. So, Eric, over to you, sir.
Yeah, I mean, I would point out that there are companies, there are U.S. companies that are working in this field, in this region, and I think, being able to champion their successes. I mean, the antimony that we get in the United States, much of it, if not most of it, comes from Tajikistan, where it is mined by a U.S. company, and it is there's a smelter. It is shipped out along the middle corridor. I mean, there are success stories, and I think you need to champion some of those. We did a conference not too long ago, which basically emphasized companies that are able to do business in this region. It is not impossible. I do think Jackson Vanik is an impediment towards U.S. business investment in the region. I do think the countries could do more to help coordinate their customs efforts. But that said, so much progress has taken place in these countries to move things out. There are remarkable changes in the last couple of years. The improvements for movement of things is great. I think, in the last Trump administration, when DFC was created, there was $1 billion deal at the time for Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan for DFC, and it was leveraging a commitment from both those countries to invest as well, and so to create a sort of a partnership fund. Unfortunately, that didn't get picked up by the Biden administration, and $1 billion just ain't what it used to be in this region anymore. I think the United States, if it wants to be a player, it's going to have to really belly up to the bar and do something big. And again, that's going to require Congress. It's going to require some creative thinking and policies. So I'll put it there.
All right, very good. And that brings us then to Reed. You have further information you'd like to add to this question before we move on to one more question?
I think just a little bit of additional color there. I think an appreciation from regional policymakers as to the long-term nature of these investments and embedding that appreciation in regulatory policy is absolutely critical. So things like things around clear, predictable, and long-term laws around investment, around loyalty sharing, around contract law, and the transparency around those laws are areas where the region has made significant improvements, I would say, in recent years. But you can always kind of continue to expand that surety for the private sector investor to, really actually make this from a policy-enabled private sector investment to actually just a market-driven investment on the basis of the resource, but also the policy environment to make sure that investors are seeing that reliable surety of ROI on those investments in the first place.
Okay, excellent additions, Reed. Thank you so much for that. I'm going to turn now to a question from our audience. But before I do that, let me note that time is moving by very quickly here. So we will try to, if we don't get to your question, people who have submitted them, please accept our apologies, but know that you can always email the experts if you ever have any hard questions you'd like to have answered. So let's go to the first question I have here that came in. What is the actual state of the transport, logistics, and infrastructure of the middle corridor, which is so important for this? Now, of course, that doesn't include Ukraine, but across Central Asia, the Caspian, Southern Caucasus, through Turkey into Europe and on into the world. It's actually from China all the way across. So the question asks about both hard infrastructure and soft infrastructure. What needs to be done to facilitate further trade, not just in critical minerals, but certainly critical minerals, but trade throughout this entire region? Uh, Eric, I see you have your hand up already. Thank you for that. Go ahead.
Well, it's too bad I'm not in the room. You could actually muzzle me. This is one of these things that it's a, there has been real progress. I mean, shocking progress. What took 42 days before to get freight from the dry port at Korgos, border with China, across to the Black Sea, going across this route that you chart. Now, admittedly, with cherry-picked freight, it's going across in far less time, probably about a third of that time. It's proof of concept that this is possible. And what we've seen is a tremendous amount of cooperation between countries in the region so that customs is harmonized. There's digitalization of the process. You see taxation, customs taxes have become actually coordinated. This is the kind of progress that's absolutely critical to make this corridor cost effective, to make it fast, so that when the war with Ukraine is over and Russia comes back and says, come back, let's, come back and use our northern line. Actually, right now, it can be faster to use the middle corridor to transit goods. Most of the transit that's on this corridor right now actually originates in the Caucasus and Central Asia. It's not a highway for goods coming from China. And I think that's kind of something that's not really appreciated very much. This corridor has opened up opportunities for goods coming from these regions and to move them westward in ways that didn't exist before. So that's all to the positive, and I think it's sort of a snowball effect that we see in this trade in transit corridor, is that success encourages more success, and it enfranchises leaders in these countries to actually do more on the coordination front. Unfortunately, and the investments that we've seen on the hard power, on the hard infrastructure side, rail improvements, more locomotives. I mean, there's been a significant investment by Kazakhstan, by Uzbekistan, by Azerbaijan. All of the countries in the region see that their future can be reinforced by having this really effective change. Unfortunately, the soft power issue now, at least for the United States, at least for the moment, seems to be off the board. The work that we were doing through USAID, through the Commerce Department's Commercial Law Development Program, I mean, these are the absolutely critical things that the United States has always been able to do that helps facilitate this kind of connectivity, because it's, for countries that have never done it before, it's all new, it's all different, and so being able to take those next steps are key, and I hope that we can get some of those programs back online. Thanks.
All right, very good. Thank you for that addition, Eric. There's another question that has come in, and I'm going to slightly rephrase it here. If the government of President Zelensky controls 50% of the critical minerals in Ukraine, specifically would he and his government want from the United States to allow us to have greater trade with those minerals? what are the steps? I know it's sort of a specialized question, but given the news that hits us every day, I think it's relevant. So think about Ukraine and what should be done for this issue. And Ariel, you have your finger up. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, I will be less than pessimistic. I spent the last 12 years on and off looking at how Ukraine handled oil and gas investment. And every time there is a successful investment or an attempted investment, including by American companies or indigenous Ukrainian companies, a state corporation comes in and sort of puts its hairy hand on the investment, punishes the investors, etc. This needs to stop. It doesn't matter whether it's Zelensky or Poroshenko or Yulia Tymoshenko as a prime minister or whoever that was. The statist instincts of the Ukrainian state, the corrupt bureaucracy, etc., is there. And for a successful American and European investment to come in, you have to have the private sector, you have to have the state-run enabling environment that is transparent and non-corrupt. Unless this is addressed, we can have a conference like this every year, several of them. We can go to Kiev if Kiev is not bombed, have a conference there, been there, done that many times. And then you'll have Ukrainian investors coming out of the woodwork crying that they spent $300 million and they got nothing for that. So I hope the Trump administration finds the ways to communicate that, to communicate that to the Zelensky administration, because the previous communications from the US, I'm a senior advisor to the US-Ukraine Business Council for 30 years. And we have this is like a Groundhog Day. Again and again every year, we have the same conversation about the interference, corruption, and the lack of enabling investment environment. I think enough said.
All right, very good. Actually, Ariel, you touched on something important here that I think that needs just a bit more explanation. And you said not personalities, it's regional realities that are really focusing on this, are the focus of this issue. And there are, what we know in the background is that there's a fundamental and historic difference between the West and how it does business and how it runs its governments, and the former Soviet Union and China, where we're talking about these issues today. So how do you bring those two sides together to benefit both players on this field? Is that a question that can be answered rather quickly here? Yes, I see. Sorry, Pini, you have a physical hand up and also your sign hand up. Go ahead, please.
No worries. Just to answer this and to add what Ariel said, the corruption is the problem, and expropriation is the problem in these regions. And, given that this is a deal that's been worked out at the top level, or is being worked out at the top level between President Trump and Zelensky, I think to give comfort to U.S. investors, I think the U.S. has to be a guarantor in these agreements, which means the U.S. has to participate. The U.S. has to represent that in the case of some of these materials, it'll be used for the national defense stockpile. But whatever the circumstances is, the only way to give comfort to U.S. investors is for the U.S. government to be some sort of a guarantor here, and for it to be part of whatever treaty it is that the path is clear. And as Ariel said, that you don't have sort of local oligarchs or whoever it is sort of sticking their hands in the pie once it's already been half-baked and a lot of investment dollars has gone in.
It's the governments, it's not the oligarchs.
Yeah. Well, the question is who controls the governments, right? But, at the end of the day, the only way to give investors comfort is for the US to be a guarantor here and to oversee what's happening on the ground.
All right. To our speakers and to the people in the audience, we have what I see on my screen, only 4 minutes left in this wonderful session. what I'd like to do is give each one of our speakers, in the order that they first spoke, an opportunity to give a closing statement of what they think is important about the most important thing about this whole issue. You don't need to do a long presentation. Let's have enough time that each one can speak. And once we've done that, then I will turn it over to our founder and CEO, Efkan Nifty, to close this out. So we started with Ariel. Ariel, your final comment as we move forward quickly, please.
Well, first of all, I want to commend CPC for an excellent panel, high quality discussion, different perspectives. Second of all, this is not just about rare earths. This is about US shifting the paradigm if we can. I'm not convinced we can. And I'm concerned, honestly, I'm concerned about some of the aspects of this policy shift that I see in terms of the creation of a permissive environment for potential corruption and whatnot. I was waiting for somebody to mention USAID, and of course, Eric, who served at USAID, mentioned USAID. USAID was a key organization to enable economic development. There were issues. I evaluated USAID programs in several countries. Sometimes I was horrified how incompetent people who ran these programs, both on the home office and in the region, were local hires and whatnot. However, we need to focus on the development of these economic projects. And the paradigm shift, in my view, is about America's ability to do stuff and to win. We haven't won a war since Gulf War. We have not decisively won a war since Gulf War. We are in a Cold War with China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea, and we will need military, economic, strategic, industrial components to that competition, as we did in the Cold War in the 20th century. For that, we need, I see your hand, Ambassador. For that, we need a successful mechanism to ensure investment in rare earth, in competition with China, in the three regions we're discussing today and beyond: Latin America, Africa, North America, etc. Thank you.
And thank you so much for that, Ariel. Pini, we go quickly to you for a concise closing statement. Over to you, sir.
Yeah, China has been running rampant globally, securing critical minerals assets for the past 30, 40 years or so. The time is here and now. These mining projects are generational, meaning that once a mining project has been acquired or obtained by China, it's gone. So it cannot be replaced, that particular mine. There's an opportunity now for the US government, for the Trump administration, to work closely with the Central Asian countries and other countries as well for the purpose of this discussion, the Central Asian countries. There's a willingness by the Central Asian countries to engage with the United States. And I think this is the time now where we're going to see an impact for the future on the decisions that the US makes in this regard.
Very good. Thank you so much for that. Reed, over to you for your final concise closing thought.
Mineral supply chain challenges are ultimately infrastructure challenges. So widening the aperture of how we resolve those challenges to also be inclusive of energy supply, logistics infrastructure will not only prove to be the necessary enabling features to put new assets into play, but also widen the aperture of partnership with the United States, who frankly might be more interested in seeing U.S. industrial benefits through a foreign power generation project in the absence of actually having a domestic mining major akin to Exxon or Chevron, et cetera.
Very good. Thank you so much for that. And then finally, Eric, your concise statement before we go. We're already slightly over timing. We don't want to get artificially turned off. So your final statement, sir.
Yeah, rapidly. we are right where we want to be. This is the cusp of the moment when we can move forward, building partnerships with Central Asia that are going to be long-term, long-lasting by investing in strategic minerals, rare earth, the refining. These long-term investments will build partnerships and security for the United States, and it will build lasting partnerships with this region. You've got Republicans in control of the U.S. government. Unleash the purse strings and get busy.
Very good final statement. Thank you for that. And I now turn it over to our founder and CEO, Mr. Efkan Nifty. To you, sir, and then we will close out for today.
Thank you, Ambassador Hoagland, and thank you for great moderation of this discussion. It's always good to have you. And I want to thank everybody, Pini, Reed, Ariel, and Eric for excellent presentations. And I want to thank to our audience for sticking with us about 90 minutes right now. And I hope they found it interesting. At the Caspian Policy Center, we plan to do more on this topic in coming weeks, months. You will see more programming from us, in person, online, webinars, as we do our work to study region from Washington and from the region as well. I want to just conclude a few things before I close this panel. We see that the region that we are talking about is a lot of the speakers already mentioned about it, diversifying its economic, political relations. And given the developments around this region, we see the opportunities emerging, and I see the different multilateral institutions are also engaged in the region, specifically Organization of Turkic States becoming a more interesting organization in the region, as many others are also concerned about its role in the region. We see a couple of articles yesterday on the Financial Times about this as well, how Russia is concerned about the OTS in that perspective. But also Israel, Gulf countries, Korea, Japan are closely engaged with the region. EU is ramping up engagement in the region. This are all positive news. And we're also talking about a region that is different than what it was 30 years ago. They have their own stake in this. They have their own national interest in this. And they actually get together a lot more than they used to. You see a lot more heads of states meetings, and they actually learn from each other and the practices that they try to put together. It's a long journey for them as they develop their relationships with the different powers and also their economy, diversifying their relationships. And I want to say that U.S. has genuine interests, which it had in '94, back in 30 years ago, basically, where U.S. closely engaged with the Western partners in developing energy that's now flowing from the region to Europe and other markets at this stage. At that time, also, infrastructure was an issue to bring out the energy from the Caspian, but that has been resolved with the close partnership and dedicated work from the Washington, from the region, and we saw pipelines built, and now the region is able to export its resources to global markets, east and actually the west as well. So there is an example of it done. There was a need that was addressed back 30 years, and I think that this time it might be maybe a lot more achievable than it used to be, because the political economic situation that the region faced 30 years ago was different in terms of their own capacities as well. And I want to also highlight that majority of the infrastructure investment in the region was not done by China or Russia or others. It is done by Kazakhstan, Azerbaijan, Turkmenistan, and the region itself, because the region is not only looking to become a bridge between the great economic powers. The main goal is to get connected with each other and also able to trade with different routes, east and west and south and north, basically. So I want to say that there is going to be a lot more changes in the region, and at the Caspian Policy Center, we stand to educate, enlighten our audience in terms of what's happening and provide you objective analysis of the region. Once again, thanks everybody for your great contributions, and we look forward to seeing you next time.
Thanks to you, and thanks to our panel, and thanks to our audience. Goodbye, all. Take care. Be well.